Triangles, N-gons, subdivisions, and lots of quad activists. Yep, it always seems like people are on a certain side of the equation when it comes to this stuff. Here's the truth. We use different techniques for different workflows. My background is in mathematics with a specific focus on graph theory, and during my undergraduate studies, this was one of my favorite classes because it is literally the foundation of how 3D polygon modeling software is built. And trust me, after studying that stuff enough, I have a very intuitive understanding of how everything works in polygon modeling software. Now, this isn't to say you need any math to understand the best workflows. In fact, it's quite the contrary. But in this video, I want to break down once and for all when and where certain workflows are the most beneficial. Now, let's hop right onto the N-gon bandwagon to start. N-gons get a really bad rep, especially from new 3D artists who aren't quite sure where they fit into a certain workflow. Here's the deal. Using N-gons on any kind of curved surface or deforming object is generally going to cause problems, especially if you use the mesh in a software that requires quad-based topology. In fact, some software can't even read N-gons properly, and your mesh would need to be properly retopologized. However, you can indeed use N-gons in plenty of hard surface modeling situations, including the following. Number one, when you're designing concept art where the final goal is simply a clean render. Number two, game assets. Number three, when you're trying to quickly model and save time. And number four, for non-destructive workflows where iteration is key. Now, the concept design part is pretty straightforward. Generally, concept artists only care about the final render. That's it. Shading problems, artifacts, crappy, messy topology, it literally does not matter. And the reason it doesn't matter is because the final output is a render. In these cases, the most important elements to focus on are the elements of visual design. There are plenty of design principles I've discussed in previous videos, so if you want to check those out, I'd recommend viewing my channel and previous videos. Basically, when I'm working on concept art, I care about the visuals, functionality, and ultimately how the final image looks. In these cases, I don't worry about topology at all. I run booleans everywhere and use that to quickly iterate through my designs. Yes, you'll probably end up getting some nasty shading problems and occasionally artifacts on your mesh, but those are best isolated rather than fixed completely. Plus, since we're only going for a clean render, we can always paint out certain problems during the post-processing stage. Like it or not, an N-gon workflow when going for concept art, especially for hard surface models, is simply the smart way to go. I will never waste my time trying to retopologize the entire mesh, especially when it does nothing for me since the final output is a render. Now, the next case where N-gons are useful is if you're creating hard surface game assets. There's a common misconception that game assets need to be all quad topology. The truth is they don't. However, be careful if you do go for an N-gon workflow here because there are quite a few reasons where quads might actually be superior. For example, if I'm UV unwrapping and I want to pack the islands more efficiently, usually I need to straighten those out, and with N-gons, I simply can't do that. I need quads. Also, if I'm using things like trim sheets, I can't unwrap these trims over a strip of N-gons. It simply won't project properly. However, aside from these small cases where you may need to be a bit more picky with your topology, it is absolutely fine to run N-gons on your game assets. But before you do, you need to do a few things. Number one, focus on shading. You don't want nasty shading all over your models, especially if you end up running booleans on something like a curved surface where the shading does go crazy. In these cases, I'd recommend isolating the shading as opposed to eliminating it completely. The only true way to get perfect shading is with perfect, consistent quad-based topology, and in my opinion, it's much more efficient to simply isolate the shading issues. As long as you isolate the shading problems, most of these small errors that you might see will get masked, especially during the texturing stage, and the viewer won't even be able to see it. So next time you're in a video game, take a look at some of the hard surface game assets and you'll probably see shading issues here and there on the hard surface models. That's because the artists aren't over obsessing over the minor shading problems. They're instead obsessing over a clean design. Now, number two, you need to make sure before exporting your game asset out of Blender that you triangulate it. This is because each 3D engine has a specific triangulation algorithm, which is usually written written differently than Blender's. So sometimes if you try to export a game asset with N-gons everywhere, what ends up happening is it won't even display properly in other software. This can be fixed by simply adding a triangulate modifier to your mesh and ticking the keep normals button to maintain the shading. Next, N-gons are incredibly useful for quick concepting, even if you do end up needing quads for your final workflow. Now, when I say N-gons are useful for quick concepting, what I really mean is booleans are useful for quick concepting, but booleans generally end up causing N-gons most of the time. Sometimes you just want to play with shapes and figure out what design flow works for you, and then once you've experimented and figured out what works for you, you can always go back and retopologize everything. And finally, N-gons are great for a quick, iterative, non-destructive workflow. Again, I'm mainly referring to booleans here because I can simply drop a boolean on my mesh, move it around, and quickly iterate through designs on my mesh. After I've figured out what I like, I can always either keep the N-gons or clean the geometry if needed for my specific pipeline. So hopefully you now understand that N-gons aren't all that big of a deal depending on your goals. However, they can be extremely problematic in other situations, which we'll now discuss. For example, take a look at these two meshes. They look identical. In terms of visuals and form, they are identical. But in terms of the actual underlying geometry, they are built completely differently. Let's take this first mesh full of N-gons and attempt to deform it. In Blender, I'll just use a simple deform modifier. And you're gonna see almost immediately the shading goes crazy and it completely breaks down. This is a massive flaw of using N-gons where you may need to deform or animate your mesh. In this case, you wanna go with the same design, but with clean, quad-based topology. Now when I try to bend it, you're going to see the shading remains clean and consistent even when deformed. Another situation to consider is that some software simply won't accept N-gons. In a program like ZBrush, generally you need to have the mesh remeshed in order to sculpt onto the geometry. And some software simply won't accept it at all. I can't speak for every software because there are so many and I simply don't use all of them, but definitely keep this in mind depending on your industry and your ultimate goals. Now, one final thing I want to discuss. A workflow you've probably seen from the beginning of time is the traditional subdivision surface modeling workflow where you model with all quads and clean topology. So, should you use it? Well, nowadays, not really, unless you need a clean mesh for reasons we discussed before. For example, if I want to make a base shape and have it curvy and a clean flow to it, it would probably be advantageous to use a sub-D modeling workflow to get that shape. However, once you no longer need sub-D to support the form of your mesh, it is totally fine to go back to our traditional Boolean and N-gon workflow, assuming that it is acceptable for your pipeline. The reason so many people have taught sub-D techniques in the past is because sub-D was simply needed. Sub-D supported clean shading and clean topology before the technology in 3D software became more advanced. Now, with modern hard surface modeling workflows, we have algorithms such as weighted normals, which help to flex the shading properly on flat surfaces, and we even have triangulation algorithms to help support us in workflows where N-gons won't work, but quads aren't needed. There's a reason I use booleans so much on my channel, and that is because they work for nearly every workflow I'm going for. The main situations where I use sub-D nowadays is if I want to get a curvy shape, which I couldn't normally accomplish with a boolean workflow. Now, if you're still a bit scared of N-gons, let me show you something interesting. Engineers, designers, and concept artists tend to use other software as well, such as Moi 3D, Fusion 360, and any of the CAD software out there. Let's say I made a quick design in Moi 3D, for example. Moi 3D doesn't have polygons because it is vector-based. However, if I wanted to export the mesh into polygons for use in Blender, watch what happens. It converts the mesh into one that contains polygons and N-gons. That is because it literally doesn't matter in workflows like these. Technically, engineers and designers are using N-gons in professional settings every single day. It's just not in the way you'd expect. Convert one of their models into polygons and you'll see N-gons all over the place, and it really isn't a problem. Now, a video some of you might be interested in is a recent one that my friend Ryu made, where he breaks down video game assets from Star Citizen and how they were created. What he found was pretty interesting, and I'll link that video video here and in the description. Hopefully next time you're worried about a specific topology situation, you first assess what your end goals are and if clean topology is even needed in the first place. For those of you interested in getting started with hard surface modeling and learning the Boolean and N-gon workflow, check out our hard surface modeling jumpstart course right here. You can also click the link in the description, and we'll take you from A to Z on a complete hard surface concept design in Blender using the basic tools. Also, we have a free ebook which goes into the subject even further if you're interested. You can grab that on blenderbros.com/ebook. Hope the video helped. Let me know if you have anything else to add in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.